Hello learners, welcome to your course of Basics of Pattern Making and Sewing, that is BFDI 072. Today we will discuss about basic sewing techniques, that is one of your unit of this particular course. So in this session we will discuss about the term pressing and what the term pressing means and why it is used and important for the garment construction. We'll discuss about the reducing seam bulks, like if there is a bulk in the seam allowance and what techniques are there that we can use to reduce the seam bulks, and we will discuss about the spatial seam situations in the process of garment manufacturing. Let us first know what is the main learning outcome or what all information you will gain from this particular unit. So after going through this unit, you can differentiate between the pressing and the ironing, the term pressing and the ironing, and you can understand the importance of pressing in garment manufacture. What is the main importance and why it is used in the garment manufacturing, you can understand. You can analyze the pressing in relation to fabric and learn the right pressing techniques. What are the techniques are used in the process of doing the pressing in the garment manufacturing, you can understand that, and what is relationship with of the pressing technique with different fabric, you can understand. And you can know the significance and uses of slash and the notches in the curved seam. So we will discuss about the spatial seam situations and what techniques you can use to make a good seam areas. So first let us talk about pressing. Pressing, we can say, is the application of heat or moisture and pressure, maintaining the actual time to give the shape, mold or crease on the fabric and garment or garment parts into the geometric forms. Like pressing, sometimes we correlate or use as a synonym for ironing, but pressing and ironing both are two different techniques which is used in the garment manufacturing. So pressing is done for making the fabric smooth or to give it a perfect form, and it is an important finishing process in apparel industry. So this is how we use the pressing to make the fabric or the garment smooth, which is used as a finishing process in the garment or apparel industry. So pressing, we can say, is done at every stage of construction, whether it is before constructing the garment and also after construction of garment, we use the pressing technique. So it can be used at every stage of construction of the garment, and it helps to smooth and shape the garment, to give it a proper shape, whether it is in the fabric form or in the garment form. We use the pressing technique to make it a smooth surface, to give it a good shape of the garment. So pressing can be done in the way of providing a heat or a steam or a pressure are the elements which are used or involved in the pressing technique. We can do the pressing of a garment or a fabric with all these three. It can be the heat, it can be the steam, or just applying a pressure, we can do the pressing technique. Steam and heat, the technique when we use of pressing with the steam or heat, it softens the fabric and make it more pliable. So it is when we make the fabric smooth, it is very easy to work on. So the pressure and the heat that sets the fabric to required shape. For that process, we use the pressing technique. For example, if we see a trouser, we have a crease line on a trouser or a pleat line on any garment are pressed during the process of garment manufacturing. Suppose we are making a trouser, we have a crease line. So for making a proper shape of that crease or any pleat if we are making on a garment, to give it a proper shape, we use the pressing technique. It can be from using the steam pressure or heat pressure. So whether what if we can use it to give a proper shape. So what now we understand the term pressing and why it is important in the garment manufacturing. So what purpose of pressing is? So pressing, we can say, has a very important role to play in the process of garment manufacturing, as we discussed now. To give it a smooth surface or a shape to the garment, we use the pressing technique. So it serves some of the functions which enhances its property and finishing properties. First, it removes the crease from the fabric, and also when we use this particular technique in the after manufacturing also. So this technique can be used before construction and after construction of garment. So to remove the crease, it is used. To set the shape of a garment, we use the pressing technique. Also, it removes the shrink and gives the fullness to the garment. To give a neat, smooth and clean appearance, we use this pressing technique. To create the shape in the garment or the fabric, it is used. And without pressing, the garment look unfinished, untidy and unattractive. Suppose if you are going to buy a garment which is not finished, which has wrinkles on that, which has the seam allowance is not finished, so you will not prefer to buy that garment. So in this case, we use this technique, pressing, so that it removes all the untidiness to make it smooth and in the proper shape. So this is the main purpose of pressing process we use in the garment manufacturing. So there are different types of pressing techniques which is used by the apparel industry for the garment construction. So let us see what types we use when we are manufacturing a garment. So pressing can be done at the two stages of garment manufacturing. Like when we are manufacturing or developing a garment, pressing technique can be used in two types. First, it is said as the under pressing, like during the process of garment manufacturing, when it is that time, it is called as the under pressing. And when we use the pressing technique after the garment has been constructed, it is said as the top pressing. So let us see in detail these two types. So under pressing, as we discussed now, it is done before the construction of the garment. So it is the pressing operation carried out during the garment is in making process. Like we have developed a pattern, we are in the process of cutting the fabric to construct a garment. In that particular step, we use the pressing technique that is said as the under pressing. And it is the pressing of any part or the section of the garment we can do in the intermediate stage of garment making. Like during the making of the collars, we can use this technique. When we are making the cuff of the any garment or this shirt, we can use this technique. When we are making the seams, darts and the pockets, at all that stages, we can use this under pressing technique. So why this particular under pressing is important? Why we should do the under pressing technique, or why we should use this? So under pressing is easier as the garment parts are flat. Suppose we have the flat fabric we are going to cut, or it is cut piece of the garment. It is very easy to press. So in this condition, the under pressing technique or under pressing type becomes very important and easy to work on. So in certain parts or seams may not be accessible when the garment is finished. Suppose there are some parts on the garment, suppose the armhole part or the collar part, when it is stitched or it is final, we cannot finish it perfectly. So that certain parts of a garment is when we use this under pressing technique or the type is very effective there. So it is important to press them during the process of construction. So at that time we use this under pressing technique. Subsequent tasks become easier and more accurate, like if the fabric has wrinkles, we have some any type of detailing there, we can make it perfectly. So garment parts that have been under pressed can be handled more easily, thus increasing the speed of the production. So it makes the process very easy and we can save our time also. So this helps to minimize the final pressing. If we have used the under pressing technique before construction, it helps to get a more finished garment developed than if we do not use this technique. So lastly, it gives us a neater finish to the garment. We get a garment with all the neat finished, and if we have some minute details on the garment, it is developed very perfectly. Then the next type which we use for the garment manufacturing of pressing is the top pressing. So top pressing, we also say it as a final pressing or off pressing. Okay. Then why this is important, what its process it follows. So this top pressing follows a pressing operation which is carried out after the garment has been made. Next type of pressing we use in the garment manufacturing process is the top pressing. We also say it as a final pressing or off pressing. Like when the garment is manufactured, we use the pressing technique that it is said as the top pressing. So this top pressing operation is carried out after the garment has been made and finally it is constructed. So it refers to the pressing of the finished garment just prior to packing. So we have just completed the sewing process, we have stitched the garment, and before going to the packing process, we do the finishing by having the top pressing techniques. So if the garment has been under pressed, final pressing is simplified. So if we have used the under pressing method, the final pressing is easy and we do not have to invest our more time on that. So large size pressing equipments and a large amount of steam is used for this particular top pressing method. Then ironing and pressing. Ironing and pressing sometimes we generally use as a synonym, but ironing and pressing, these two are different terms and different techniques we have. So ironing is sliding or moving the heat iron like we generally do at our home, or ironing we have the heated iron which we move across or slide across the garment when we want to, which we have, and from over the material to smoothen the out of its surface, to make it the outer surface of that particular garment smooth, we use this ironing process. So this ironing process may lead to stretching of the fabric, and as you slide the iron or move the heated iron on the garment. And apart from this ironing process, we also have the pressing process. Pressing is applying any type of pressure onto the material with a hot iron by keeping the iron at one place. Like in the ironing process, what we do, we just slide or move the iron, heated iron onto the fabric. But in the pressing technique, we apply the pressure, a heated iron at a particular place of the garment. So removing it and placing it on another part of the material, we do this type of process to get it pressed, and rather sliding it in the form on the surface of the garment. So the main difference in the ironing and pressing is, in the ironing we just slide or move the heated iron, and in the pressing process we just apply or keep the heated iron at the particular one place. Then there are some general tips or the steps we should follow when we are doing this pressing technique, whether it is under pressing or the top pressing. First thing to keep in mind is to press, do not iron. We have to do the press technique, like we have to keep the iron, whether it is a steam iron or the heated iron, at a particular part or a particular position of the garment or the fabric. So first thing, we have to press, do not iron. Second is use the correct temperature setting on the thermostat of the iron. According to the fabric, we have to select the temperature which is correct for the and suitable for that fabric, and we have to set the thermostat of the iron for your fabric. So before pressing, it is important to press a test sample of fabric to discover the ideal condition under which the garment can be pressed. Like before going to do the pressing of a whole garment or a fabric, we should just do a sample check of the temperature, what is needed for the fabric. So try to iron on a small piece of fabric at a low temperature, and gradually you can increase the temperature to do the pressing technique. So to prevent the stretching, try to press along the grain of the fabric. Like if we are doing the pressing technique, what we should do, if for the avoiding of stretching of the fabric, we should just do the pressing on the grain line or the grain side of the fabric. Then another step which should be kept in mind, that is when you are using the steam, the moisture must be allowed to dry off before moving on to the next part. Like if we are using the steam iron or steam pressing method, the moisture which is there must be allowed to dry off before moving to the next part of the garment. So if this is not done, like if we have not allowed the moisture to be dried off, the fabric which we are on which we are doing the pressing will tend to crumple rather than giving a smooth finish. It will crumple there without instead of giving a smooth finish, and it might stretch out its shape. We can lose the shape of that particular garment. So it should be kept in mind that moisture should be dried off. Then always press seam and dart as you proceed. Like we have the seam part and the dart parts on a garment. So we should always press the seam part or the seam lines and the dart part or the dart lines separately to make it or give it a proper shape. Always press a seam before top stitching to ensure a smooth surface. Like if we have started a garment manufacturing to going for a stitching, first before going to the stitching part, we should finish or we should press the seam part or the seam area of any garment or any pattern before going the top stitching of that particular part. So before pressing a seam open, press it along the length of stitching first, and this helps to stitching to sink into the fabric and ensuring a smooth finish to the finished appearance of the garment. So this is how we use the pressing methods. And one more important step or point we can say to keep in mind, try pressing the fabric on the wrong side, not on the right side of the fabric or the garment which we are using. Try the pressing of the fabric on the wrong side wherever it is possible, or use a pressing cloth. We should have a pressing cloth which is a thin, very thin cloth which we keep above our final fabric or the garment, and then we do the pressing technique. So we should use the pressing cloth to avoid damaging the right side of the fabric, and pressing cloth protects the fabric from like shiny marks or from the changing in the fabric surface, feel and appearance. Sometimes when we do the pressing, technique or we do the pressing of the garment, we just feel after that we have the appearance or the feel of the fabric is changed. So to avoid that, we should use the pressing cloth on the right side of the fabric. So never press over pins. If we have pinned any fabric, we should not press over the pins, because we can have the mark of that pin on the fabric. So this will damage the iron also and fabric also. So prevent press marks on the right side of the fabric by placing the strip of paper under the edge of seam allowance, darts, pleats to prevent impression from appearing on the right side. Also, do not overpress, like the time which is required and the temperature which is required, we should follow that. We should not overpress, like suppose sometimes we feel that we will do extra pressing that will give more finish to the fabric or the garment. We should not do that. So use the tip of the iron on small places. If we have some corners on the garment, we should use the tip of the iron to make it press. Avoid using the heavy pressure on the garment. When pressing the entire garment, when you are pressing the entire garment, start with the small areas. Like first we should do the collars, then we should have the cuff, pocket and other design details if we have, like the pleats or the dart. Then go for the sleeve, yoke, etc. Finally, press the large flat area of the garment. So now we understand. So when pressing the entire garment, we should start with the small areas. Like first we should do the collars, then cuff, pocket and other design details. Then we should go for the sleeve, yoke, etc. and finally press the large flat area of the garment. So in this process or this sequence we should follow when we are doing the pressing of the garment. So this were some guidelines or the step we follow when we want to do the pressing of the garment. Now pressing in relation to fabric, like we have different types of fabric which we use for the manufacturing of the garment. So there is relation of fabric and the pressing. Let us see according to some of the fabrics we use for the manufacturing of garment. First general fabric which we use is the cotton and linen. Cotton, when we are using these fabric, cotton and linen, what pressing process or what precautions we should take care of? So when we are using a cotton, they are fairly easy to press. These cotton and linen fabric, it is very easy to handle and very easy to press. So they require a hot iron. Moisture and pressure can be used. Like for the cotton and linen, we need a iron which is hot, and moisture and pressure can be also used. If using a steam iron, when we are using a steam iron for the cotton or linen fabric, or if the fabric has a glaze finish, sometime if the cotton fabric is mercerized or it have some glaze finish, shiny finish on the surface, these fabric can be pressed on the right side. We can do the pressing on the right side. Otherwise, should be pressed on the wrong side to avoid the scouring. So to avoid the scouring, we can use it from the wrong side. Like for the linen, tends to shrink if too much moisture is used. Like if we use too much moisture on the linen fabric, it shrinks. But moisture must be used in order to remove the crease. This is how we use the steps for the cotton and linen fabric. Then when we are using pressing for the silk fabric, if this is a fine this silk fabrics are a fine quality, it can be very difficult to press. So there are different qualities of silk fabric we have. So if it is of a very fine quality, it can be very difficult to press. So there is a tendency for silk to cling, and they are reluctant to lie flat. Like if we put the silk fabric flat, it will get removed, it will not form its shape. So it is very not easy to put it there. So use only a light pressure and moderate hot iron for the pressing. Moisture is rarely used because of the possibility of watermarks. Sometimes if you have noticed and seen that if you put water on the silk fabric, it leaves a watermark there. So avoid having the watermarks. So we can avoid using the moisture during the pressing technique. Then for the synthetic fabrics, what we use for the garment manufacturing, these require a cool iron because it is man-made fibers are there. We have chemically developed. So if we put a hot iron there, the fabric or the yarn may get damaged. So these synthetic fibers require a cool iron, as too much heat will melt the fabric what we are using. So use little or no moisture to avoid the risk of watermark. Like if we like silk, we can have a more watermark if we use the moisture. In the same way, for the synthetic also, we avoid using the moisture to avoid the watermarking there. Use medium pressure to prevent dart and seam impression. Like if we use a heavy pressure, we can like suppose we have front and back part of a garment and we are doing the whole pressing together, we can have the dart or the seam mark on the back portion also. If we have the back dart, it can come on the front part also. So avoid having the heavy pressure. We can use a medium pressure to prevent the dart and seam impressions. So it is very difficult to remove crease from this type of fabric. So we should use it very wisely. Then if we have the lightweight woolens, like when we are using a woolen fabric for the construction, press these with a moderately hot iron, steam and pressure. Care must be taken to avoid overuse of pressure, as this can cause impression on the right side of the garment. So this fabric will score easily and tends to shine if steam is not used. So steam can also be used to shrink area of the garment to fit the shape of the body. So this is how we follow the instruction for the lightweight woolen fabric we are using for the construction of garment. Then if we have the pile fabric, so when we have the pile fabric, pressing must be carried out on the wrong side of the fabric, and this type of fabric must be used on special equipment like needle board or to prevent flattening of the pile. Like pile, so if you have seen the towels, that surface of that towels is said as the pile if have loops on the surface of the fabric. So avoid damaging that pile effect. We use the different technique, different equipment, special equipment, that is needle board, to prevent flattening of the pile. So if directly we press that fabric at a time, we can damage the effect of pile. So light pressure is required to prevent damage, especially shiny patches and the iron marks. So this is how we do the pressing of the pile fabric. So one another thing apart from the pressing technique what we discussed, we have some seam bulk. Like there are some techniques we need to understand to remove the seam bulk from the garment. So first technique we use to remove or to reduce the seam bulk from the garment is the trimming process. Trimming process, this means cutting off some of the seam allowance if it interferes with the further construction step. Like we have discussed about the seam allowance, and like we have, if the garment is being for the process of stitching and we have given the seam allowance of suppose 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeter, and we feel that this particular seam allowance is creating some interference in the or creating a bulk in the garment, we do remove that extra allowance from the pattern or when we are doing the stitching. So that for that removing of the extra margins from the garment, we use the trimming process, that we cut the extra allowance which is there to remove or to make the fabric less bulky. Then we also use another technique for removing the seam bulk is the slash or clipping method. Slashing or clipping method is a slit or a cut we make on the allowance or the extra margin made on the allowance or in the inward curves. Like if we are having the allowance on the armhole part or the neckline part, then on the inward curve seams, so that the fabric fits around the curve of the body very properly. So when we have cut or do the slashing or make some slits on there, then we can have a proper fit of that. So using a point of scissor, make a cut perpendicular to the edge of the seam allowance what we are having. We can also use the notching technique. So notches are, we have discussed, are small V-shaped piece of fabric that are cut from the seam allowance on the outward curve to reduce the amount of fabric so as to give the flat edge when the seam is pressed and it is opened. So this is how these technique, whether it is trimming, slashing or notching, we use to reduce the seam bulk from the garment. Then there are some special seam situations, like we have developed the seam types and stitching of the garment, but there are some special seam situations which we should keep in mind when we are constructing a garment. So some special techniques are needed to stitching for when we are stitching the bias or the curve or gathers intersecting or the corner seams. Like bias, we have discussed the bias grain. If we have the bias seam in any garment, when stitching two bias edges, bias means the fabric which is cut at the 45-degree of angle, that particular part or that particular edge of the garment is very stretchable. So it makes us difficult to stitch in the, like if we are stitching in the simple process, we cannot stitch it perfectly. So when stitching two bias edges, keep the fabric tight without stretching so that the seam doesn't pucker. And when joining the bias edges to a straight edge, switch with the bias side on the top to prevent the stretching and puckers. So this is how we do the bias seam stitching. Then if we have a curved seam in a garment, to stitch a smooth curved seam and achieve same even distance from the edge, what we do, we use slower machine speed and reduce the stitch length. So if we have the curved seam, want to stitch that, we need to slow down the speed of the machine and reduce the stitch length so that we can have a finished curved seam. So if both fabric curve in the same direction, we can have the slash or notch at the seam allowance as required after stitching the seam, so that the fabric will get lie very easily and in a flat way. So this is how, if this curve seam we have and we want to stitch, we follow this process. If we want to stitch the gather seam while attaching a gathers fabric to the flat fabric, if we are making a, suppose we are making a skirt or a frock, if we have a fabric which has gathers and we want to attach that gathered fabric to a flat fabric, what we can do, it should be on the top of the fabric so that the gathers do not get flattened and turn into tiny pleats. So any time when you are using a gathered stitching process, if we have the gathered fabric and the flat fabric, the gathered fabric should be kept on the top of the flat fabric to that you are attaching to avoid it or to do not damage the gathers what we have made. If we are making a corner seam, if suppose we have make a kurta and we have to make a smooth corner, finished corner, to strengthen the that corner, reduce the stitch length for a short distance on each side of the corner, like small stitches, that is 15 to 20 stitch per inch, are used to strengthen or corner or a point of that particular corner seam. So this is how we see that there are some special seam situations in the garment which we should keep in mind, and the process to make that particular seam situations perfectly, we should follow the instruction. So in this particular session we discussed about the pressing, discussed that pressing is an essential element in the production of a perfectly finished garment. Like we discussed, we do the under pressing before construction and top pressing which is after construction to get a finished garment. So good pressing technique are an important as good sewing skills. If we have good sewing skills and we do not know the pressing technique, we cannot achieve with a good constructed garment. So both we should understand perfectly. And we discussed the process of reducing the seam bulk and special seam situations in the process of garment construction. So this is all about this particular topic, basic sewing techniques. Hope this session will be beneficial for you. Thank you.